Here's a preview of what I will say in this video. Do you need any more evidence than Colossians 3 verse 22 to show that the Bible is pro-slavery and anti-woman? And taken out of context, these words sound pretty bad for a Christian school teacher. Taken out of context, context really matters. You know Pampers? The diapers, right? When they just started bringing Pampers to Japan, they thought it was a great idea to show a stork on the packaging. You know, the classic baby delivering method. Well, guess what? Sales were flat, and this left the Pampers people scratching their heads. What went wrong? Turns out the stork didn't jive with Japanese culture, at least not when it came to babies. Consumers were wondering, what's the deal with the bird? It turns out that in Japan, storks are not responsible for delivering babies to expecting parents. They never have been. You know what is responsible though? Large peaches. It should come as no surprise that things don't always easily translate from one culture to another. And you can get some things really wrong if you don't understand context. Here's a billboard that the American Atheists put up a few years back. It references Colossians 3 verse 22, and they are right. The verse does say, slaves obey your masters. And do you know what else that passage says? Wives submit to your husbands. Do you need any more evidence than Colossians 3 verse 22 to show that the Bible is pro-slavery and anti-woman? But what about context? If you consider context, things might look a little different. And I don't just mean to make an argument that Paul, the author of Colossians, was influenced by his culture and needs to be forgiven for his context. No, I mean to show that this passage from Colossians, when taken in context, contains very relevant instructions on how our modern relationships should work in our modern society. The first part of the context of this verse is the verses around it. Let's look at these. See the word Lord in this passage? It appears 7 times. Being a Christian is all about recognizing Jesus as Lord of everything, and that means your whole life. Here's verse 17, and whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. This verse says that our relationship with Jesus shapes and determines how we think and act in all other relationships. This is what Paul is saying in the book of Colossians. And in this passage, he's saying Jesus is Lord of your household relationships. So what was a household like back in Paul's day? What's the cultural context for our passage? Way back in the Greco-Roman world, philosophers considered the properly organized household to be a microcosm of reality, the state, the gods, the universe. Here's Aristotle. Seeing then that the state is made up of households, before speaking of the state we must speak of the management of the household. The parts of household management correspond to the persons who compose the household. The fewest possible parts of the family are master and slave, husband and wife, father and children. So that's the Roman household: the husband, the wife, the children, and the slaves. And in the Roman household, the man had absolute authority over everyone else in the household, even to the point where he could sell or kill his children if they made him mad. Paul is writing to the church in Colossae, a Greco-Roman town. A town that was filled with Greco-Roman households. And his whole point is, if Jesus is the Lord of your life, then that will affect how your Greco-Roman household will operate. And then he describes what that would look like. And he makes it pretty clear that a Christian Greco-Roman household will operate very differently from a standard, basic, everyday Greco-Roman household. In what way differently? Verse 18, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. So this sort of talk triggers most of us in the modern West. Submit? No way. In our culture, no one submits to anyone under any circumstances. Individual autonomy is our regula numerus unis. The Bible isn't the only thing with a context here. Self-determinism is a huge part of our context. And we need to understand that we might be just a little touchy with this kind of language. We have a tendency to consider our context in absolute terms. We are normal. And that means good and true and beautiful, and everyone else is dumb. The cure for this? Read books from different times and cultures. Oh, and travel. Don't miss the significance of this verse. When Paul addresses everyone in the Greco-Roman household, who is the first group of people he's addressing? The wives. That he is addressing them at all is unheard of. That he's addressing them first is scandalous. If a regular Roman wrote this passage, it would say, husbands, make your wives submit to you as is fitting. So not only does Paul address women, and addresses them first, he also assumes her agency. Paul is not commanding obedience. It says, submit yourselves. Submission is a free choice. It's a willing deferral. That's a whole different thing. A lot of the people who are uptight about the Bible asking wives to submit to husbands don't go on and read the next verse, or they don't understand it. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. So what does love mean in this context? I mean, what does it mean in the way that Paul uses it? In short, it means sacrificially. A husband is called here to put the flourishing of his wife above that of his own. Jesus, who is Lord, sacrificed himself for the people over whom he was Lord. So this husband-wife relationship completely turns the Greco-Roman one upside down. It was set up for the flourishing of the husband and the father and the master. What would marriage look like, even today, if the wife submitted and the husband loved, sacrificed everything for her? So the question we need to be asking ourselves is this: if this is what Paul said to the Greco-Roman relationship between husband and wife, what would he say about this relationship in the modern West? So what does this passage not say? Among other things, it doesn't say that all women must submit to men, or that husbands need to enforce submission, or that wives must mindlessly obey their husbands, or that wives must subject themselves to oppression and exploitation, or that wives are inferior to their husbands. The Bible doesn't say any of these things, any more than I'm saying them. But anyone can screenshot this and make it look like I'm saying it. Here, I'll do it for you. Context really matters. Okay, now for the children. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Again, Paul is addressing children directly, as if they mattered. They didn't so much in a Greco-Roman context. There wasn't a whole lot of consideration given to children's feelings. It was all about obedience. It was a because I said so kind of situation. Okay, let's move on to slavery. We need to understand some things about context. Roman slavery was not like the slavery in the Americas from the 16th to the 19th centuries, as this billboard asserts. During the first century, slavery was not based on race or anything else that targeted a particular group. Slaves sometimes possessed higher education and occupied responsible professional roles. Some people chose to become slaves for economic or social benefits. Slaves had reasonable prospects for gaining freedom after a period of service, typically within 10 to 20 years, or by their 30s at the latest. It was possible for slaves to save money towards purchasing their own freedom, and it was not universally accepted that they were inferior. The slave-master relationship looked more like the relationship between an employee and an employer than it looked like the kind of slavery that usually comes to mind when we hear the word slavery. In general, the master provided for all their needs, and the slave provided the labor. Because the father, or the pater familias, was the absolute authority in the household, Roman slavery was of course susceptible to abuse. Anytime you have someone with legal authority over someone else, there can be serious problems. And this is the very reason that Paul addresses it in this passage. In a Christian household, things will be different. So Paul addresses them, again, directly. In our modern context, we usually leave our house to go to work, but not so in the Roman world. So what the Bible is saying about the master-slave relationship is pretty much what the Bible is saying about our boss-employee relationship. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eyes are on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. You know how some people work a lot harder when they know the boss is watching than when they think that he or she is not? Paul says, don't do that. The lordship of Jesus affects all aspects of our lives. So when we work, it's like we're working for him. We are working for him. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. And if you're the boss, remember that you aren't the main boss. Jesus is your boss too, and that will affect how you treat the people who work for you. This passage from the book of Colossians is about the dignity of all people. Paul is directly addressing women and children and slaves. In this context, you never address these people, but you communicate through the master. But the difference here is that there is one master above everyone, not the head of the household. It is the Lord. Imagine Rome and all those households, and imagine what would happen if every Roman household ran under the principles that Paul articulates here. Our households are very different, But the implications of these verses from Colossians are that we are to understand that the Lordship of Christ will have a significant impact on how we operate in our relationships within our modern context. What if husbands and wives went out of their way to know and delight each other in every way that they could think of? And what if parents wouldn't be jerks to their kids, but neither would they be afraid to discipline them? And what would happen if bosses sought the flourishing of their employees, and employees were always sincere and did their best, even when no one was watching? And what if that kind of thing happened in all our relationships?
So the point here is that we are not supposed to be trying to duplicate a Roman household in our modern context. We're going to have to do some work and try to figure out what the Lordship of Jesus Christ looks like in our context. Should be fun. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.